Gunfire cracks through the forest like tearing metal as mud splashes under boots running too fast and too blindly. A radio screaming with static before a woman's voice cuts through it, breathless, controlled, terrified. "Command, this is Lark 7. I'm compromised. Repeat time compromised." Artillery thunders beyond the trees, shaking the ground as flares rise and paint the night red. The smell of burning oil and wet earth choking the air. She wasn't supposed to be here, and she certainly wasn't supposed to survive this long. Later, maps would show her route ending at this exact point. Yet no body was ever found, no weapon, no blood trail, no evidence of escapingly silence. And within the next 30 seconds, something impossible happened. It is Western Europe. Winter of 1944. A moment when the war's outcome no longer depends solely on firepower, but on intelligence. Secrets, and who disappears without a trace. Her name was never meant to be public officially. She did not exist but unofficially. She was one of the most effective field operatives ever sent behind enemy lines. Her mission appeared simple on paper: infiltrate a corridor believed to be lightly defended. But her true task was far more dangerous: to confirm the existence of a hidden relay network capable of rerouting entire divisions into carefully prepared traps. If she failed, thousands of troops would walk straight into annihilation. If she succeeded, the entire timeline of the war could shift. Command believed she had 72 hours to complete the mission, yet she lasted 9 days. And no one realized the real threat hadn't even appeared yet. At exactly to 17 hours. Deep inside a reinforced intelligence bunker miles from the front line, a junior signals officer froze mid-motion. Headphones pressed tight against his ears as if he hadn't quite trusted what he was hearing. The transmission cutting through the night did not come from enemy frequencies, nor did it match any known resistance channel. It was Allied encryption, perfectly structured. Flawlessly timed, but its origin point pulsed from a sector that had been declared electronically dead for weeks. The room fell silent as technicians reran the signal through verification systems again and again. Each confirmation making the truth harder to ignore. Someone, somewhere behind enemy lines, was transmitting using codes that only a handful of operatives in the entire theater even knew existed. Then the message resolved into a single, devastating line. Lark 7 has seen the map. Every officer in the room understood the implication instantly. That phrase was never to be spoken aloud, never to be transmitted unless a very specific contingency had been triggered. It meant she had uncovered a strategic structure so catastrophic that its discovery alone placed her beyond the threshold of recoverable risk. The map was not a document, nor a single location. It was a living system, a network designed to predict Allied movement days in advance, funneling troops into invisible kill zones before commanders even realized they had made a mistake. If she had truly seen it, then the enemy knew she had seen it too. As the implications rippled through command, a second alarm cut in. Radar operators reported movement anomalies along 3 separate sectors. Units repositioning with unnatural coordination. Not advancing toward Allied lines, but angling inward, converging toward a single tightening point. Her last known position, what made it worse, was the speed. These weren't reactive maneuvers. They were pre-planned, executed as if a switch had been flipped. Someone had given the order before the transmission was ever intercepted. Back in the field, the night around her was no longer quiet in the way soldiers feared. It was quiet in a way that meant she had already been marked. Patrol patterns shifted. Dogs were released where none had been before. Vehicles cut their engines miles out and advanced on foot. She felt it before she saw it, the subtle tightening of the battlefield. The sense that every path forward had already been anticipated. When she keyed her transmitter again, her voice was lower now, stripped of urgency, almost calm. "They're not searching," she said. "They're positioning." Command debated extraction in seconds that felt like hours. Helicopters could be scrambled. Fighters could be rerouted. But every option intersected with enemy airspace that had, inexplicably, just become active again. It was as if the sky itself had been folded shut. And then the transmission fractured her signal, breaking into sharp bursts of sound, its fragments slipping through like pieces of a shattered mirror. "If I move now, they'll know if I stay." they'll wait. The final data spike came without warning. Enemy flares ignited simultaneously across multiple ridgelines, not illuminating the forest but sealing it in, cutting off every dark route of escape. The relay network she had discovered had already begun to react, not to her presence but to her knowledge. And as her signal vanished entirely from Allied screens, one realization settled heavily over the command room. This was no longer a rescue scenario. This was containment, and the next 90 seconds would decide. Not just whether she survived, but whether anyone would ever know what she had. Uncovered it all, the forest no longer behaved like a battlefield. It behaved like a trap that had already been closed. From the command room's elevated perspective, the map glowed with motion units sliding into position with mechanical precision, arrows bending inward, converging not on supply routes or defensive strongholds, but on empty terrain that moments earlier had seemed strategically irrelevant. Officers stared at the display in disbelief, some leaning closer as if proximity might change what they were seeing. Enemy movements weren't responding to Allied pressure. They weren't retreating. They weren't advancing. They were synchronizing. On the ground, she felt the change before intelligence confirmed it. The air itself seemed heavier, every sound sharper and more deliberate. Twigs snapped where no patrol should have been. A distant engine shut off too cleanly, too intentionally. Even the wind felt wrong, carrying the faint metallic scent of fuel and oil. Through a stretch of woodland that should have smelled only of damp leaves and frost, she slowed her pace, counting steps between breaths, forcing her body to remain calm while her instincts screamed that the margin for error had vanished. Her radio crackled once, just a whisper of static, then went dead again, in the bunker. Technicians tried rerouting frequencies, boosting signal strength, forcing connections through backup relays that hadn't been used in months. Nothing held. Her signal flickered briefly, a heartbeat of data appearing on the screen before dissolving into noise. One officer slammed his fist against the table, not in anger, but in helplessness. They were blind now, watching shapes move on a map without hearing the voice at the center of it all. Conflicting orders began to circulate. One commander demanded immediate diversionary strikes to pull enemy units away. Another warned that any sudden movement would confirm her location. Intelligence analysts argued that the relay network she had uncovered might be feeding off Allied reactions themselves, predicting behavior not by surveillance, but by probability. The more they tried to save her, the more information they might be giving away. Back in the forest, the first flare went up. It burst above the tree line, not with the frantic urgency of a search flare, but with deliberate timing, blooming slowly. Bathing the ground in cold white light, she froze instantly, pressing herself into the shadow of a fallen tree. Heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard. The flare wasn't meant to find her. It was meant to limit her options. Moments later, another ignited farther east, then another to the south. They were drawing a perimeter. She adjusted her route, abandoning the extraction corridor entirely, moving instead toward terrain marked on her mental map as tactically useless steep ground. Poor visibility, no strategic value. If the enemy was predicting movement, she would give them something that made no sense. Her boots sank into mud, cold seeping through worn leather, every step measured, every breath controlled. Somewhere behind her, dogs barked once, then fell silent, as if commanded to wait. At command, the realization settled with growing dread. The enemy wasn't improvising. They were executing a script. Reports began arriving from resistance contacts, operating miles. Away roadblocks appearing where none had existed hours earlier. Patrols rerouted without explanation. Entire villages evacuated under vague pretexts. Whatever system she had uncovered wasn't localized. It was adaptive, reshaping the battlefield in real time. One analyst quietly suggested the unthinkable. The relay network might be calculating outcomes faster than Allied command structures could respond. Then, without warning, her signal returned. Not fully. Not cleanly. Just enough. "I'm changing pattern," she said, voice low, steady. "If they move again, don't react." Those were the last complete words Command would ever hear from her. A moment later, gunfire erupted somewhere beyond visual range, not close enough to confirm contact, not far enough to dismiss. The sound echoed unnaturally through the forest, followed by shouting in a language she understood well enough to know they were not panicked. They were coordinating. The chaos was no longer accidental. It was engineered, and as the enemy net tightened around a woman who officially did not exist, Command faced a realization that would haunt post-war historians for decades. This was no longer a mission spiraling out of control. This was a test, and she was at its center. The first Allied response came disguised as restraint. Fighters remained grounded. Artillery stayed silent. From the outside, it looked like hesitation, but inside the command bunker, it was calculation bordering on desperation. If the enemy network truly predicted reactions, then stillness itself might be the only weapon left. Maps updated in real time as operators watched enemy units hesitate, then reconfigure, then hesitate again, as if waiting for a move that never came. For a brief, dangerous moment, it seemed the pattern had been disrupted. Then the fractures began. A resistance cell operating west of her position reported sudden contact in ambush where none should have been possible. Another cell, kilometers away, described the opposite. Enemy patrols pulling back without explanation, abandoning checkpoints they had held for months. The battlefield was no longer behaving as a single system. It was splitting into contradictions, as if two opposing commands were issuing orders simultaneously. In the forest, she recognized the shift immediately. The pressure eased, vanished, but loosened like fingers, relaxing just enough to invite movement. It was an invitation she didn't trust. She doubled back through her own tracks, then cut sideways across frozen ground, deliberately breaking the logic of pursuit. Every decision was calculated to appear irrational. Every pause was intentional. If the network was reading probabilities, she would become one. A new transmission cut through the static short, sharp, authoritative. Lark 7. Extraction window opening. Repeat. Extraction window opening. The voice was allied. The code was correct. The coordinates aligned with a secondary fallback zone few even knew existed. And that was the problem. In command, heads snapped up. Officers exchanged looks that needed no words. No extraction order had been issued. No window had been authorized. Someone or something was speaking with their voice. They tried to warn her. The channel jammed instantly. On the ground, she stood motionless as the message repeated. She understood the danger faster than command ever could. A false rescue was worse than no rescue at all. It meant the enemy wasn't just predicting Allied behavior anymore. It was impersonating it. Feeding hope into the system, waiting to see who would take the bait, she keyed her transmitter once more, forcing the signal through on a burst so brief it barely registered. Negative, she said. That window doesn't exist. Gunfire erupted seconds later, not at her position, but precisely where the false extraction coordinates pointed. Flares followed, then the unmistakable roar of engines. Enemy units surged into the clearing, weapons raised, sweeping the area where they expected her to appear. They had planned to capture her alive. She was already gone. The realization hit command with sickening clarity. She wasn't just running anymore. She was counterprogramming the battlefield, feeding the enemy false outcomes, forcing their network to expose itself by reacting to movements that never resolved. Every wrong turn she took rippled outward, distorting predictions, causing units to arrive seconds too late or minutes too early. The system that had seemed flawless began to stutter, but the cost was immediate and brutal. Resistance. Fighters paid for the confusion with their lives. A supply convoy was wiped out after being redirected along a route that should have been safe. Friendly units received delayed orders, conflicting commands, instructions that arrived just long enough to cause hesitation before being revoked. The battlefield fractured into isolated moments of violence with no clear front line, no stable narrative, and through it all, her signal faded in and out like a dying heartbeat. Her final confirmed movement was recorded not by radio, but by enemy documentation captured months later, brief notation, describing a lone operative deliberately entering terrain marked as tactically irrelevant, non-essential, and unrecoverable. A place where pursuit offered no advantage. A place where outcomes could not be calculated. The enemy network recalibrated. One last time, then it stopped responding. Units froze mid-advance. Orders contradicted each other. Patrols withdrew without explanation. Whatever logic had driven their precision collapsed into hesitation, then paralysis. The system had lost its reference point. She had removed herself from it, in the command bunker. Screens went dark one by one as feeds normalized. Movements returning to patterns, commanders recognized messy, human, flawed. The immediate crisis passed, but the room remained silent. No one spoke her name. No one logged the moment. There would be no report acknowledging what had just happened, because to record it would mean admitting the truth, that the battle had been won not by overwhelming force, nor superior numbers, but by a woman who understood that the only way to defeat a machine built on prediction was to disappear from its future entirely. And with that realization, step for ends, not with resolution, but with absence, the battlefield calms. The signal does not return, and the war moves forward, carrying a secret it will never officially recognize. Asterisk. The collapse of the enemy network did not bring relief, brought fear. In the hours after her signal vanished, commanders stared at stabilized maps that felt suddenly untrustworthy, as if calm itself were a deception. Enemy units had halted, then withdrawn, then gone silent in ways that defied doctrine. No counterattack followed. No regrouping appeared on aerial reconnaissance. It was as though an unseen hand had frozen the battlefield mid-thought, leaving both sides suspended in an uneasy pause. Veterans in the bunker would later describe it as the most terrifying quiet of the entire war, because it meant something decisive had already happened. No one could be sure what the cost would be. Intelligence analysts began piecing together fragments from intercepted communications, resistance reports, and delayed field logs. The picture that emerged was incomplete but deeply unsettling. The relay system she had uncovered wasn't merely a toolet, was a dependency. Enemy command structures had leaned on it so heavily that when its predictive loop failed, human decision-making faltered. Orders contradicted one another. Initiative vanished. Units waited for instructions that never arrived. The system had not just guided them, it had replaced them, and she had stepped into its blind spot. But command faced a brutal truth. If the network was truly disabled, it would not remain so for long. The enemy would adapt, rebuild, correct the flaw, unless something prevented them from understanding why it had failed. That something was her. Debate erupted behind closed doors. Some argued that her disappearance was already enough, that the damage done could not be reversed. Others warned that if she were captured alive, if she were forced to explain what she had seen, the enemy could rebuild the system stronger, faster, immune to the chaos she had introduced. There were no easy conclusions, only narrowing options. And beneath every argument lay the same unspoken assumption. The mission had evolved beyond rescue as dawn broke over the contested region. Allied forces received new orders, aggressive advances into zones that had been considered too risky just days earlier. The push was relentless, exploiting the enemy's hesitation before coherence could return. Troops moved through abandoned checkpoints and half-destroyed command posts, finding evidence of frantic evacuations, burned maps, smashed radios, safes left open in haste. It was working. The enemy was retreating not because they were being defeated, but because they no longer trusted their own information. And still, no word from her. Then came the intercepted message that changed everything. It was brief, fragmented, clearly not meant for Allied ears, but unmistakably related to her. A field report referencing the woman without trajectory, an anomaly that had caused cascading prediction failures. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion, but its implication was unmistakable. They did not know where she was, what she had done after disappearing, or whether she was still alive. The system had lost her completely. Asterisk, for the first time since her mission began. Command understood the scale of what she had accomplished. By abandoning every logical route, by refusing extraction, by rejecting false rescue, by moving into terrain that made no strategic sense, she had become untrackable, not just physically, but mathematically. The enemy could not model her. And because they could not model her, they could not repair what she had broken. But the cost of that realization was immediate and personal. A junior officer asked the question, no. One wanted to answer, if she's still alive. Do we want her to come back? Silence followed, because bringing her home would mean restoring a variable the enemy might learn from. Her survival, paradoxically, could undo her success. The conclusion settled heavily over the room, unspoken yet understood by every senior figure present. History would remember the battlefield shift. It would remember the sudden collapse of enemy coordination. It would not remember the woman who made it possible. Not officially, the climax arrived not with gunfire, but with a decision. Her status was changed. Not recovered. Not active. Presumed lost under operational necessity, a classification so rare it existed. Only to close files that could never be explained. Search efforts were quietly scaled back. Reconnaissance flights altered their paths. Questions from resistance groups went unanswered. Even internal references to her designation were reduced and removed entirely. On the front lines, the advance continued, unstoppable now, fueled by momentum and confusion. Cities fell faster than expected. Defensive lines crumbled without resistance. Soldiers moved through territory that felt abandoned by something more than troops, as if the war itself had lost its rhythm. And somewhere beyond all recorded maps, beyond extraction zones and fallback points, a woman who had been sent on a mission she was never meant to survive remained unaccounted for. Her disappearance had reached its climax, not in death, nor in capture, but in consequence. The war bent around the space she left behind, and nothing that followed could ever fully explain why. Asterisk, weeks passed, and the forest fell silent once more, but it was a silence that carried weight far heavier than any explosion or gunfire. Allied forces advanced into territory that had been destabilized not by brute force, but by absence, by a single operative who had refused to follow predictable patterns and, in doing so, shattered an entire system of command. Burned-out vehicles, abandoned supplies, and scorched maps marked the terrain. Each one a ghostly reminder of battles that had been fought, victories claimed, and losses endured without the world ever knowing who had truly turned the tide in the command bunkers. Reports circulated carefully, deliberately stripped of her name. Intelligence analysts used coded references, euphemisms, and vague descriptors, as if acknowledging her contributions openly would somehow undo the fragile victory they had inherited. When historians later examined declassified files, they found mentions of anomalies, of unexplained failures in enemy communication, never the operative who had caused them. Her mission had succeeded in full measure, yet she had been written out of existence. Letters and diaries recovered after the war told fragments of the human cost. A resistance fighter described glimpsing a shadow moving through the fog too fast, too deliberate, disappearing before anyone could speak her name aloud. Another journal entry spoke of a single figure entering territory marked as unreachable, never to be seen again. Even in those personal accounts, the operative's name was absent. She was referred to only by her call sign, a cipher of memory and legend. The truth, it seemed, had become too dangerous to preserve in ink. Whispers persisted among those who had survived. They spoke of moments when the enemy seemed to hesitate without reason. Movements frozen mid-action, units retreating against orders as if compelled by something unseen. Some claimed they could feel her presence in those moments of suspended chaos, guiding events without revealing herself, shaping outcomes in ways that would never appear on any map or official record. She had become a ghost, both everywhere and nowhere. A figure whose actions altered history, while leaving history itself unaware. And then there were the archives. Classified files, sealed for decades. Occasionally referenced her existence with vague language. Operative removed from timeline. Subject unaccounted for operational anomaly. Nothing explained her disappearance. Nothing explained how she had achieved what no one else could. Requests to access these files were routinely denied, locked behind layers of bureaucracy, secrecy, and silence. It was as if the state itself wished to forget her. Even as her actions reverberated through the course of the war, the chilling truth endured. She had vanished on a mission she was never supposed to survive. Yet her absence had reshaped battles, saved lives, and broken systems thought infallible. The world remembered the war, the victories, the losses, but the operative herself remained a shadow in the archives, a phantom behind the turning tide of history. Letters, diaries, eyewitness accounts, every trace hinted at her brilliance and courage, but none could confirm where she had gone, or if she had ever truly left the battlefield at all. And the final, haunting question remains: whatever she witnessed, whatever choices she made in those frozen, impossible moments, how much of it is still hidden in the secret corners of history? The files remain sealed. The records remain redacted. And the truth about what she saw that night, the secret she carried, and the power she held over the course of entire armies is still locked away. Waiting for a world perhaps not ready to know, she vanished. And in that disappearance, she became legend.